Jay Hamilton with Jonathan Williams, the Vice President Chief Economist at ALEC. Let's do a follow-up story to something we worked on a year or so ago, the state and local tax deduction, which was part of the Trump tax package. You're seeing lots of pushback from some of the states.
Well, right. The high tax states that have had subsidies for their high tax and high spending didn't like the idea that that was going to get limited by the Trump tax reform bill a couple of years ago. And, you are going to see some of those states continue to try to protest the $10,000 annual limit. On the other hand, though, it's coming back to really benefit taxpayers in states like New Jersey, a state you're very familiar with, Jay, in that, New Jersey actually stopped a big tax increase on income taxes because they realized that they couldn't ask the rest of the country to subsidize it by allowing them to write it off as a SALT deduction. So I think it's had its intended effect. That's why the ALEC legislators organized around the letter that we did, talking about the necessary piece of tax reform being stopping the subsidy to high tax and high spend states. And we're seeing it play out like we thought it would, really.
There's been lots of movement. I think there's even some potential legal action from New York State. I know there's also some other issues about what is a charity, what is a nonprofit. So these high tax states are really trying to wiggle their way around the SALT deduction. Go over that a bit.
There were some schemes that don't even pass the laugh test when it comes to these charities that states were trying to set up in order to circumvent the SALT limitations. And luckily the IRS has shot those down like we thought that they would, as being sham pieces to try to get around federal tax law. So that has largely come to an end. But there was that suit by New York and I think Connecticut and New Jersey and some other states saying that this was a targeted piece of the tax bill that was politically motivated. I think that's not going to go anywhere either, but they do have to have their day to hear that out. One of the things about that particular piece is this tax reform has been very good to states across the board. Even if state taxpayers under those high tax regimes may be paying more in some cases, you look at states like New York where their linkage to the federal tax code has meant surplus dollars for New York State and some of the other states because the states base their income tax codes on the federal code. So in all, the totality of it is federal tax reform has been one of the best gifts to state budgets they could ever ask for. So it's kind of strange that states are actually suing over this, but I guess that's just because they wanted to keep their subsidies to their high tax and high spend ways.
We're about a year and a half out from when this passed, I think. And this may have been sort of one of the unintended or perhaps intended consequences. Have there been surprises besides the state pushback, which you sort of could have bet on anyway? Any other consequences that have come out of SALT that have surprised you?
Well, other than stopping tax increases, that's been one that was predictable, but it's been very good effect of federal tax reform is states are now rethinking that because their taxpayers have to pay 100% of the new cost of a new tax increase at the state level versus having a piece of it subsidized. But the other thing is, states are doubling down on their own tax reform efforts because of federal tax reform. And so we've seen about 20 states now across the board cut taxes at the state level after federal tax reform because of the surplus dollars, because of a strong economy. And that's been very good. It's been the second windfall of federal tax reform for taxpayers. And that's something we hope to be the case because it was the case post Ronald Reagan's tax reform in 1986. But it's very good to see it coming to fruition again.
As a group that's, all for limited government and free enterprises, this limits government, doesn't it?
It sure does, right. And those dollars are not being used to grow government and build new spending in many cases. Many states did the right thing. Iowa, Missouri had the largest tax cuts in state history after federal tax reform. We're talking about some big tax changes that are going to have some great impacts for those states and their taxpayers.
You have good advice for folks that may be living in the high tax states that are getting hurt by this. What do you say to some of those citizens?
Well, I would say, first of all, you have the freedom to move, right? And that's the great thing about our 50 laboratories of democracy, and people vote with their feet all the time, rich states, poor states. We always talk about this phenomenon. It seems like almost every day, Jay, the Drudge Report has a story about how real estate agents are just booming in South Florida right now, of all the New Yorkers and New Jersey residents that are picking up and leaving. And that's been one of the big impacts is for so long we've talked about this migration away from high tax states to low tax states and states with no income tax, but they're just doubling down on this effect because of federal tax reform. So we're seeing even a greater effect than we had in previous years.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for updating us on the state and local tax deduction. I know that was a big fight on ALEC's part, and it seems to be doing the job it was intended to do.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jay.
All right.